Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back to a time when the ocean wasn't a vacation destination but a giant churning bowl of ice water designed to test the limits of human endurance. We're traveling to the deck of a medieval raiding vessel, a precursor to the golden age pirates we see in movies during the height of a winter storm in the North Atlantic. You're standing on planks of oak that are so cold they feel like they're vibrating against the soles of your leather boots. Boots that, let's be honest, have the insulation value of a wet paper bag. If you were actually there, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than an hour before your internal organs decided to go on a permanent strike. But since you're tucked under a duvet, we can explore this frozen hellscape in comfort. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel while the rest of the world sleeps. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the upper deck, and every step is a gamble. The sea spray doesn't just hit the wood, it flash freezes, turning the ship into a floating skating rink where the stakes aren't a gold medal, but a one-way trip into the black, suffocating depths of the ocean. The wind isn't just a breeze, it's a physical weight, a wall of screaming air that smells of salt and ancient ice. It whips around your face, finding every microscopic gap in your wool tunic, biting at your skin with the persistence of a hungry mosquito. You look up at the rigging, and the ropes aren't the flexible hemp they were in the morning. They're coated in a thick, translucent glaze of ice, looking less like nautical equipment and more like the skeletal remains of some giant sea creature. In this era, roughly the start of the 14th century, the world was shifting into what we now call the Little Ice Age. This is our mainstream historical fact for the night. Global temperatures were plummeting, and for a sailor, this meant that winter at sea was no longer a season, but a survival horror game. The North Sea and the Atlantic became graveyards of slush and gale force winds. You're standing there, watching your breath bloom in front of you like a ghost, wondering how anyone could possibly find the best sleep in a place where even the air feels like it's trying to kill you. The upper deck is a place of utility and suffering. There are no heaters here, no glowing screens to distract you from the fact that your nose has lost all sensation. Your only GPS is a set of stars that seem colder and more distant than usual, twinkling with a clinical indifference to your plight. To help you visualize this, think of the upper deck not as a part of a ship, but as the inside of a walk-in industrial freezer that someone decided to tilt back and forth at a 45-degree angle. It's a place of constant motion and zero comfort. You see a fellow sailor, a pirate by modern definitions, though he'd probably just call himself an entrepreneur with a very aggressive business model, huddled near the mainmast. He smeared something thick and grayish on his face. This leads us to a quirky fringe tidbit. Medieval sailors often used a mixture of rendered seal blubber and soot as a primitive face mask to prevent windburn and trap a tiny layer of heat against the skin. It makes him look like a swamp monster, and he smells like a rancid candle, but in this environment, vanity is the first thing to die. You watch him try to coil a frozen rope, his movements slow and mechanical. His joints probably ache with the kind of deep, thrumming pain that feels like it's settled into the very marrow of his bones. You realize that for these men, sleep isn't just a luxury, it's a biological necessity that they have to fight for. They don't just go to bed, they retreat. They descend from this frozen purgatory into the bowels of the ship, seeking anything that isn't the biting wind. Historians still argue whether these early raiders were politically motivated or just desperate victims of climate change. driven to sea because their crops were failing in the frozen soil of their homelands. Regardless of their why, their how involves finding a way to shut down their brains while the world outside is literally freezing solid. The contrast between the upper deck and what lies below is the difference between a nightmare and a fever dream. Up here, the sounds are sharp, the crack of ice breaking off a spar, the whistle of the gale through the shrouds, the rhythmic thud of the hull hitting a swell. It's an acoustic assault. You find yourself leaning against the rail, your gloved hands, made of boiled leather and lined with itchy sheep's wool, gripping the wood so hard they've gone numb. You're looking for a sign of land, a flicker of a lighthouse that doesn't exist yet, or perhaps just the promise that the sun will eventually return. But the winter night at these latitudes is an ego-crushing expanse of darkness. It feels infinite. You decide it's time to move. You can't stay on the upper deck anymore. The cold is starting to seep past your layers, turning your core into a block of ice. Every shiver is your body's way of screaming for a change of scenery. You head toward the narrow, steep hatch that leads below. As you pull back the heavy, salt-stiffened canvas cover, a blast of air hits you from below. It isn't fresh by any modern standard. It's thick, humid, and carries the scent of 100 unwashed bodies, rotting wood, and something vaguely metallic. But to your freezing skin, it feels like a warm hug from a very dirty giant. This is the threshold. You're leaving the refrigerator of the deck and entering the communal incubator of the lower decks. You descend the ladder, your boots clunking on the rungs, and the transition is immediate. The wind dies down to a muffled roar, replaced by the internal groans of the ship's timbers. It sounds like the ship itself is breathing, a slow, rhythmic creak that will eventually become your lullaby. You're entering a world where personal space is a myth and aroma is a permanent resident. But as you look around the dim, lantern-lit space of the berthing deck, you see the first glimpses of how these men managed to find rest. They weren't just sleeping, they were hacking the environment, using every trick in the book to turn a wooden box into a sanctuary. You see the way the low ceiling traps the heat rising from the men below. You see the way they've packed themselves in, creating a collective thermal mass that defies the ice outside. It's messy, it's cramped, and it's loud, but it's alive. You feel the first hint of drowsiness tugging at your eyelids, not from the cold, which usually brings a frantic, sharp kind of wakefulness, but from the sudden, heavy warmth of the hold. You're beginning to understand that best sleep is relative. Compared to the frozen death of the upper deck, this stinking, crowded room is a 5-star resort. You take one last look back up at the hatch, where a stray snowflake drifts down and melts instantly in the humid air of the hold. The journey into the mechanics of pirate rest has just begun. You step off the last rung of the ladder and your boots meet the floor of the berthing deck with a dull, wet thud. Down here, the concept of a floor is more of a suggestion than a reality. It's a slick, treacherous surface coated in a fine film of seawater, spilled ale, and various fluids that have leaked from the barrels of salted pork stored nearby. In a modern house, you'd call the hazmat team. On a medieval raiding vessel, this is just the carpet. If you tried to sleep directly on these planks, you'd wake up. If you woke up at all with a case of hypothermia, so advanced your blood would have the consistency of a slushy. This is why you look upward, toward the ceiling, where the real engineering of pirate survival is on full display. Above the damp, rotting floorboards hangs a canopy of heavy, cream-colored canvas. These are the hammocks, the medieval sailor's version of cloud storage for human bodies. You reach out and touch one. The fabric is coarse like a giant's exfoliator, woven from hemp that's been treated with a bit of salt spray and a lot of sweat. To a modern observer, a hammock looks like a backyard relaxation tool for a Sunday afternoon, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, this was the equivalent of a high-tech ergonomic sleep system. It's essentially a suspension bridge for your spine. The genius of the hammock isn't just that it keeps you off the Satan soup collecting on the floorboards. It's the physics of the thing. You see, when the ship rolls, and it's rolling a lot right now, tilting a good 20 degrees every few seconds, the floor moves with the hull. If you were lying on a bunk or a chest, your body would be sliding back and forth like a loose grape on a dinner plate. But the hammock stays centered. Gravity is the pirate's interior designer here. Because the hammock is suspended from 2 points, it acts as a self-leveling gimbal. While the ship is doing its best impression of a washing machine on the spin cycle, you stay perfectly level in your canvas cocoon. It's like having noise-canceling headphones, but for your equilibrium. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that while many people associate hammocks with the Caribbean, they were actually discovered by Europeans during early voyages to the Americas, where indigenous peoples had been using them for centuries to stay away from ground-dwelling snakes and insects. Pirates, being the ultimate early adopters of anything that made life 1% less miserable, grabbed this tech and never looked back. It was a revolutionary upgrade from the medieval standard of sleeping on a hard wooden sea chest, which offered all the comfort of a granite tombstone and none of the swaying charm. You watch a veteran crewman, a man whose face looks like a topographical map of a very rocky region, climb into his hammock. It's a practiced athletic move. If you or I tried it, we'd probably perform an accidental backflip and land head first in the bilge water, which would be a very embarrassing way to go. But he slides in and the canvas wraps around him like a giant burrito. This wrapping effect is crucial. In the freezing winter hold, the hammock traps a layer of air between the canvas and your body. It's a primitive form of double glazing. Historians still argue whether the introduction of the hammock was the single greatest contributor to naval health, as it finally separated the crew from the damp, disease-ridden floor where rats held their nightly track meets. The air in here is thick enough to chew. It smells of wet dog, old rope, and the lingering ghost of a cabbage stew that was served 3 days ago. But as you find your own designated hook in the overhead beams, you realize that personal space is a concept invented by people who don't live in a 50-foot wooden box with 60 other men. Your hammock will be hanging barely 6 inches away from the next guy's. You're basically sleeping in a giant swinging loaf of human bread. It's cozy in a way that would make a modern therapist have a nervous breakdown. But out here, in the middle of a frozen gale, that proximity is the only thing keeping the frost from your bones. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. Some medieval sailors were so attached to their sway that they claimed they couldn't digest their food properly if they weren't in a hammock. They believed the rhythmic motion acted as a mechanical aid to the stomach, churning their hardtack and salt beef like a biological butter churn. Whether it actually helped or was just a collective delusion brought on by too much cheap grog, the result was the same. The hammock was their sanctuary. You pull yourself up into your own canvas sling. The hemp ropes creak, a high-pitched, rhythmic scree-scree as they take your weight. The beams above you, massive ribs of oak, groan under the tension. You feel the ship lurch to the left, but you stay still. It's a bizarre sensation, feeling the entire world tilt around you while you remain the horizontal center of the universe. It's almost hypnotic. You look at the knots holding you up, complex, multi-layered macrame that would take a Boy Scout 3 years to learn. These knots are the only thing standing between you and a very rude awakening on the cold floor. If one slips, It's a gravity-fed alarm clock that ends with a bruised tailbone and a lot of creative swearing. As you settle in, you notice that the canvas isn't just plain fabric. Many pirates would customize their hammocks with bits of stolen silk or velvet scavenged from captured merchant ships, lining the inside to prevent canvas burn on their neck and face. It's a small, flamboyant touch of luxury in a world of grime. You adjust your position, feeling the way the hammock supports your lower back, a level of lumbar support that you wouldn't expect from a piece of 14th century raiding gear. The darkness below you is absolute, but the ceiling of hammocks above is a landscape of shifting shadows. You see the faint glow of a single horn lantern hanging from a central beam, its light swinging wildly with the ship's motion. It casts long, distorted shadows of the swinging men across the hull, making it look like the ship is filled with giant, rhythmic pendulums. You realize that you're no longer a person, you're a component of a machine. The ship breathes, the waves pound, and you swing. It's the most engineered sleep you've ever had, a triumph of necessity over environment. But the canvas, as effective as it is at leveling you out, does nothing for the cold that's still lurking in your clothes. To fix that, you'll need to understand the oily, itchy secrets of the pirate's winter wardrobe. You're settled into your hammock, the canvas hugging you like a giant coarse burrito. But as the ship plunges into another trough and the icy draft from the hatch snakes its way towards you, you realize that the canvas is just the outer shell. To survive a medieval winter at sea, you need more than just a suspension system. You need the medieval equivalent of a high-performance survival suit. Your skin is currently in a complicated, long-distance relationship with warmth, and the only mediator is your wardrobe. You aren't wearing pajamas. There is no such thing as a sleep set in the 14th century unless you count wearing every single item of clothing you own at the same time. You look down at your sleeves. They're made of thick, heavy wool that has been felted until it's almost as stiff as cardboard. In the modern world, we think of wool as a luxury, a soft cashmere sweater or a fancy suit. But here, wool is a weapon of war against the elements. It's the original Gore-Tex. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that wool is one of the few natural fibers that can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture and still retain its insulating properties. This is vital because, remember the Satan soup on the floor and the frozen ropes on deck? You are perpetually damp. If you were wearing cotton or linen, that moisture would turn into a conductor for the cold, pulling the heat out of your body like a biological vacuum. But the wool keeps trapping pockets of air, heating them with your body's own flickering furnace. Of course, the price for this warmth is a level of itchiness that borders on a spiritual trial. It feels like 1,000 tiny, caffeinated ants are holding a rave on your skin. Medieval wool isn't refined, it's full of kemp, the stiff, prickly hairs from the sheep that refuse to be tamed by the loom. You learn to ignore it, or rather, the itch becomes a constant background hum, like the white noise of a fan, eventually lulling you into a trance. Then there's the smell. You don't just smell like a pirate, you smell like a wet, very stressed sheep. This is because your clothes haven't been cleaned in the modern sense since the day they were woven. They are saturated with lanolin, the natural grease found in sheep's wool. For a sailor, lanolin is liquid gold. It acts as a natural water repellent, causing the sea spray to bead up and roll off your chest rather than soaking through to your skin. To help you visualize this, imagine wearing a sweater made of oily hair that someone has rubbed with a bit of old bacon grease. It's disgusting, but it's the only reason you're not a human icicle. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. Some pirates, especially those who had spent time in Mediterranean ports, were known to rub their woolens with thieves' oil, a potent aromatic blend of cloves, lemon, cinnamon, and eucalyptus. Legend has it that tomb robbers used it to avoid the plague, but on a ship, it served a much more practical purpose. It acted as a primitive chemical barrier against the lice that lived in the seams of your tunics. It also made you smell slightly less like a farm animal and more like a very spicy, very dangerous kitchen cabinet. You adjust your position in the hammock and the layers shift against each other. You're wearing a linen undershirt, which is currently the color of a storm cloud, followed by a wool tunic, and then over that, a heavy coat made of boiled wool that's been treated with wax. On your legs, you have wool hose, which are basically thick footed leggings held up by garters that are currently cutting off your circulation. It's a layering system that would make a modern mountaineer nod in approval. You've basically turned yourself into a human onion, with each layer designed to trap a different frequency of heat. Historians still argue whether medieval sailors actually slept in their sea kit, their full heavy gear, or if they stripped down to their base linen layers to let their skin breathe. While some archaeological finds suggest a variety of garments, the sheer, crushing reality of a North Atlantic winter suggests that if you took your coat off, you were essentially inviting death to dinner. Most likely, you only removed your boots, if you were lucky enough to have a dry place to put them, and kept the rest of the armor on. Taking off your woolens in the middle of a gale would be like a space traveler taking off their helmet just to see if the air was fresh. Speaking of boots, yours are currently tucked into the side of your hammock, near your feet. They're made of turned leather and they have all the arch support of a damp pancake. They're currently stuffed with dry straw or bits of old shredded wool to help soak up the sweat and seawater. It's less like a footwear solution and more like an ongoing edible experiment for the ship's rats. You've learned that the secret to warm feet isn't the leather, it's the stuffing. On your head, you're wearing a coif, a close-fitting linen cap, and over that, a heavy wool hood that covers your neck and shoulders. You look like a very grimy monk who's decided to take up a life of maritime crime. This hood is your most precious possession. In the hammock, you pull the hood forward until it covers your eyes, creating a personal blackout curtain in the middle of the chaotic berthing deck. It also keeps your head heat from escaping into the damp air of the hold. Since about 40% of your body heat can escape through your head, a slight historical exaggeration, but your shivering brain believes it, the hood is your primary life support system. You lie there, the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers acting as a metronome for your thoughts. The fabric against your cheek is rough, smelling of salt, grease, and the faint, citrusy ghost of that thieves' oil. You feel the weight of the layers pressing down on you. In a modern bed, a heavy blanket is weighted therapy. Here, your entire wardrobe provides that pressure. It's a sensory overload that somehow leads to a sensory shutdown. You aren't just wearing clothes, you are encased in a textile fortress. But clothes can only do so much. Heat isn't just about trapping what you have, it's about communal generation. As you drift closer to sleep, you become aware of the sounds around you, the heavy breathing of 50 other men, the rustle of their own woolly fortresses, and the collective warmth that is starting to turn the berthing deck into a humid, human-powered sauna. You're not just an individual anymore. You're a single cell in a large, shivering, hairy organism that's determined to see the sunrise. The living heat of the ship is about to become your best friend, and you're going to have to get very comfortable with being very, very close to your shipmates. The heat you felt as you descended into the hold isn't a dry, clean heat like you'd get from a modern radiator. No, this is a heavy, biological humidity that sits on your skin like a damp, unwanted towel. You're currently suspended in the sensory symphony of the berthing deck, a place where the concept of privacy went to die and was replaced by a fragrant bouquet of human failure. To help you visualize the atmosphere, imagine a high school gym locker room that has been relocated into the basement of a damp cave, then filled with 60 men who haven't seen a bar of soap since the previous administration. It's thick, it's dense, it's the kind of air you don't just breathe, you're basically drinking it. As you lie in your hammock, the visual world is a chaotic dance of shadows. The only light comes from a few horn lanterns, primitive devices where the glass is actually a thin, scraped down sheet of cow horn. It gives off a dim, buttery yellow glow that doesn't so much illuminate the room as it does highlight the swirling dust and the steam rising from the wet wool coats of your shipmates. The lanterns swing in a wide arc, casting long, jerky shadows against the oak ribs of the ship. It looks like the hull is alive, shifting and stretching with every wave. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that the berthing deck on a medieval vessel was a multi-purpose nightmare. During the day, it was the dining hall, the armory, and the repair shop. At night, it was the bedroom. There were no walls, no partitions, just a vast open space where everyone, from the lowest deckhand to the seasoned raiders, shared the same square footage. This lack of hierarchy in the sleeping quarters was a practical necessity. On a ship, wasted space is a crime against survival. The sounds down here are what truly define the experience. You have the external sounds, the constant muffled thwack of the hull hitting the icy swells and the screaming of the wind through the cracks in the hatch. But the internal sounds are a masterpiece of maritime ASMR. There's the rhythmic creak, groan creak of the ship's timbers, which sounds like the ocean's way of complaining about its chronic back problems. Then there's the human element. You are surrounded by a chorus of snoring that spans the entire musical scale, from the high-pitched whistle of the man to your left to the deep, tectonic rumble of the giant sleeping below you. Every few seconds, someone coughs, a dry, hacking sound that reminds you that medieval medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree. You'd think this cacophony would keep you awake, but in the weird logic of the pirate brain, it's actually comforting. Total silence on a ship is terrifying. Silence means the wind has stopped. Or worse, the ship has stopped moving. This noise is the sound of the machine working. It's the sound of being part of a pack. Historians still argue whether these early ships had any formal quiet hours or codes of conduct regarding noise. Some suggest that silence was enforced by the simple, democratic threat of a heavy leather boot being thrown at the head of anyone being unnecessarily loud. It's the ultimate form of peer-reviewed sleep hygiene. Now, let's talk about the smell, because your nose is currently doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's a layered experience. At the top, you have the sharp, acidic tang of cheap vinegar. This leads us to our quirky fringe tidbit. Medieval sailors would often sprinkle vinegar on the floorboards or soak rags in it and hang them from the beams. They weren't just being tidy. They believed in the theory of miasma, the idea that bad air caused disease. They thought the sharp scent of vinegar would cut the sickness out of the air. Below the vinegar, you have the heavy, oily scent of tallow candles and the rancid smell of salt pork. And at the very bottom, the foundational scent is the bilge, a stagnant soup of seawater and waste that sloshes around in the very bottom of the ship. It smells like a swamp that has given up on its dreams. Yet, despite the olfactory assault, there is something weirdly cozy about it. The humidity, while gross, actually keeps the temperature from dropping too rapidly. Your breath doesn't bloom in front of you down here. The collective body heat of 60 men, combined with the insulation of the thick oak hull, has raised the temperature to a level that is almost pleasant. If you ignore the fact that you're essentially sleeping in a giant wooden petri dish, it's the warmest place for 100 miles in any direction. You find yourself staring at the overhead, the underside of the deck above you. It's close, maybe only 2 feet from your face. You can see the individual grains in the wood, stained dark by years of smoke and dampness. Occasionally, a drop of condensation forms on a beam and falls, landing on your forehead with a cold, sharp plip. You wipe it away with a woolly sleeve, feeling the grit of salt on your skin. Everything is slightly sticky, everything is slightly damp, but you are horizontal, and in the world of the winter pirate, that is a victory. You look over the edge of your hammock at the deck below. In the dim light, you see the shapes of sea chests and coils of rope. They look like sleeping beasts. You see a pair of boots standing by themselves, looking lonely in the shadows. To help you visualize this, think of your own bedroom, but remove the carpet, the bed frame, the clean sheet, and the privacy, and then add the constant sensation of being inside a very slow motion paint mixer. It's a space that demands a complete surrender of your modern standards. There's a strange psychological comfort in this sensory overload. In the darkness of the North Atlantic winter, the external world is a void, an endless, freezing nothingness. But inside this hold, the world is full. It's loud, it's smelly, and it's crowded, but it's undeniably alive. You aren't just a person trying to sleep, you are part of a warm, vibrating hive. The sensory symphony isn't just noise, it's proof of existence. You close your eyes, letting the smell of vinegar and wet sheep wash over you, and you feel the weight of the tactical sharing that's about to happen. Because in a world without central heating, the man sleeping 6 inches away from you isn't just a roommate, he's your primary heat source. You're about to learn that personal space is a luxury that only people on land can afford. You're starting to drift off, that heavy, wool-induced trance finally taking hold when you feel a sudden, jarring shift in the tension of the ropes nearby. The hammock next to yours, which was empty when you climbed in, suddenly sags under a new weight. This is the reality of maritime life. The bed never truly stays empty. In the world of 14th century seafaring, personal property is a fluid concept, especially when it comes to furniture. You've just witnessed the commencement of hot bunking, a term we use today for a practice that was once just called not dying of a frozen spine. To help you visualize this, think of a modern co-working space, but instead of sharing a desk and a high-speed internet connection, you're sharing a piece of damp canvas and a very specific pocket of residual body heat. It's like an Uber for sleeping, but there's no app, and the only rating you get is whether or not you left the bed warm for the next guy. In the dead of a medieval winter, a cold hammock is a tragedy. A warm one is a luxury beyond price. The system is governed by the watch. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is the traditional maritime watch system, which divided the crew into 2 halves, usually the starboard and the larboard, or port watches. They operated in 4-hour rotations. This means that at any given moment, half the crew is on deck doing the heavy lifting, while the other half is below deck trying to cram a full night's sleep into a 4-hour window. When the bell rings to signal the change of watch, a massive, synchronized migration occurs. The frozen, exhausted men from the upper deck descend like shivering ghosts, while the relatively warm, groggy men from the hold climb up to take their places. For you, lying in your hammock, this means that the person who just climbed into the sling next to you has brought a fresh blast of winter with them. You can feel the cold radiating off his coat like he's a human ice cube, but within minutes, the magic of thermal dynamics takes over. Because you are packed so tightly together, hammocks literally touching, your warmth begins to bleed into his, and his cold begins to be neutralized by yours. It's a tactical sharing of calories. You aren't just roommates, you are a biological radiator system. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. In some of the more organized pirate crews of the late medieval period, there was a specific unwritten etiquette to the hot bunking swap. If you were the one leaving the hammock, it was considered a grave insult, sometimes punishable by a forfeit of your ale ration to leave the bed cold. This meant that if you had to get up a few minutes early for your shift, you might place a heated brick wrapped in a rag or even a large, heavy stone that had been sitting near the galley fire into the hammock to maintain the thermal bridge for the man coming off duty. It's the medieval version of a heated car seat, but with more soot and a higher risk of third-degree burns. As you lie there, the man next to you lets out a long, shuddering sigh as his frozen joints begin to thaw. You can hear his teeth chattering, a rapid, rhythmic clicking that sounds like a frantic typewriter. Historians still argue whether these pirate crews, who often operated outside the rigid, soul-crushing discipline of national navies, had more flexible sleep schedules. Some evidence suggests that pirate articles or codes often allowed for all-hands sleep periods during calm weather, a democratic luxury that would have been unthinkable on a Royal Navy vessel. But in the winter, the articles don't matter as much as the laws of thermodynamics. You find yourself focused on the sensation of the lingering warmth. When you eventually have to get up for your watch, you will be handing over your spot to someone else. There's a strange, intimate cycle to it. You are sliding into the heat print of the man before you, and someone else will do the same for you. In a world where everything is cold, damp, and hostile, this 98.6 degree legacy is the only thing that feels human. It's a bizarrely communal way to live. You know the exact shape of your shipmate's shoulder blades not because you've seen them, but because that's where the hammock is the warmest when you climb in. Of course, this tactical sharing comes with a darker side. If the man before you had a fever, you're probably going to get it. If he had the itch, which, let's be honest, everyone does, you're now sharing his microscopic livestock. But when it's 10 degrees below freezing and the wind is howling through the rigging like a banshee, you don't care about a few lice. You care about the fact that your toes are finally starting to tingle with returning blood flow. The hot bunking system also serves a psychological purpose. It ensures that the berthing deck is never empty, which means the human furnace never turns off. If everyone went on deck at once, the hold would lose its hard-won humidity and warmth in minutes. By keeping a rotating half occupancy, the crew maintains a permanent, glowing ember of heat in the center of the ship. You are essentially living inside a giant wooden thermos. You listen to the sounds of the swap, the low grunts, the thud of boots being dropped carefully, so as not to hit anyone sleeping below, and the whispered curses of men trying to find their gear in the dark. It's a choreographed dance performed by people who are too tired to care. To help you visualize this, imagine a game of Tetris where the blocks are made of grumpy, bearded men in wet wool, and the goal is to keep the warmth meter from hitting zero. As the new arrival next to you settles in, the swaying of the hammocks becomes synchronized. You both move with the roll of the ship, two pendulums swinging in a dark clock. The initial shock of his cold presence has faded, replaced by a shared, humid bubble of comfort. You realize that best sleep in this context isn't about peace or quiet. It's about the absence of the big cold. It's about the victory of the pack over the void. You close your eyes again, the rhythmic breathing of your neighbor acting as a secondary metronome. You're starting to feel the effects of the evening's liquid blanket, the grog you drank before coming below. It's a chemical heat that's currently battling the external chill, and it's a vital part of the pirate's winter survival kit. But, as you'll soon discover, the warmth of the grog is a dangerous illusion, a biological lie that your brain is more than happy to believe as long as it means you can stop shivering for 5 minutes. For now, though, the hammock is warm, the man next to you is quiet, and the ice is on the other side of the wood. That's enough. You're lying there in the swaying darkness, your body finally settling into the thermal legacy left by the guy who occupied this hammock before you. But there's another heat source at work, one that's currently radiating from the center of your chest and making your fingertips tingle with a false sense of security. It's a liquid blanket, the generous portion of grog or heavy ale you knock back before crawling into your canvas cocoon. In the modern world, we might call this a nightcap, but for a medieval pirate in the dead of winter, alcohol wasn't just a social lubricant. It was a biological lie you told yourself so you could stop shivering long enough to lose consciousness. To help you visualize the quality of what you've just consumed, imagine a liquid that has the color of swamp water, the consistency of motor oil, and a flavor profile that can best be described as burnt toast soaked in turpentine. This wasn't the top shelf spiced rum you see in fancy bottles today. This was often Kill Devil or early forms of aquavita, a spirit so potent it could probably be used to strip paint off the hull if the crew weren't so busy using it to strip the existential dread from their minds. It's less like a beverage and more like a chemical reset button for your nervous system. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is a bit of a buzzkill, but it's essential. Alcohol is a vasodilator. When you drink that heavy, spiced ale, it causes your blood vessels to open up, sending a rush of warm blood from your core to your extremities. This is why your skin feels like it's glowing, and why the itchy wool of your tunic suddenly feels like soft silk. However, this is a biological scam. While you feel warmer, you are actually losing core body heat at an accelerated rate because all that warmth is being dumped out through your skin into the damp air of the hold. In the context of survival, your liquid blanket is actually a liquid radiator that's effectively cooling your engine while the car is parked in a blizzard. But your brain doesn't care about thermodynamics right now. It just cares that the ice water in your veins has been replaced by something that feels like molten sunlight. You feel a sense of heavy, dizzy relaxation. The swaying of the hammock, which might have made you seasick an hour ago, now feels like the ship is gently rocking you to sleep like a giant salty mother. You're floating in a hazy, boozy equilibrium. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit for you. During the coldest nights, the crew wouldn't just drink cold beer, they would prepare a concoction known as flip. You'd take a large tin mug, fill it with a mixture of beer, rum, and a bit of molasses or sugar if you'd successfully raided a merchant ship recently. Then, you'd take a loggerhead, a long iron rod with a bulbous end that had been sitting in the galley's cook stove until it was glowing a terrifying cherry red. You'd plunge that red-hot iron directly into the mug. The liquid would hiss and scream, the sugar would caramelize instantly, and the whole mess would foam up into a thick, creamy, steaming head. It tasted like a campfire in a cup and smelled like victory. More importantly, it provided a genuine, if brief, blast of thermal energy to your internal organs. Historians still argue whether the perpetual state of functional inebriation on these ships was a result of choice or necessity. Some scholars suggest that since the water in the ship's barrels was often a stagnant, green slurry of algae and drowned weevils, the alcohol was literally the only thing safe to drink. The fermentation process killed the bacteria that would otherwise turn your insides into an Olympic-level track event. In this view, the pirate wasn't a drunkard, he was just a man who preferred a slight buzz to a fatal case of dysentery. It was medicine with a very high ABV. You find yourself staring at the shadows on the ceiling, feeling the way the grog has dulled the sharp edges of your reality. The itch of the kemp in your wool shirt is still there, but it feels distant, like it's happening to someone else's skin. The sound of the man snoring next to you, that tectonic rumble we talked about, no longer sounds like a nuisance. Now it sounds like a rhythmic, comforting bass line to the sensory symphony of the ship. You're beginning to experience the grog-induced sleep, a deep, heavy slumber that is remarkably easy to fall into, but notoriously difficult to wake up from when the watch bell eventually tolls. There's a certain dark humor in your situation. You're suspended in a piece of canvas, wrapped in greasy sheep's hair, surrounded by 50 men who smell like a wet basement, and you've just poisoned your internal thermostat with rocket fuel. And yet, in this moment, you feel like the king of the world. To help you visualize this mental state, think of it as low battery mode on a smartphone. The alcohol has dimmed the screen, turned off the background apps, and disabled the GPS. You're just barely running, but you're saving enough energy to keep the core systems from freezing solid before dawn. As you drift, you might remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we discussed in another life, a reminder that humans have always used bizarre substances to cope with a hostile environment. Compared to that, a mug of hot, caramelized beer seems almost sophisticated. You feel the liquid blanket settling into your limbs, making them heavy and unresponsive. Your toes, which were sharp needles of pain just an hour ago, are now just vague, warm suggestions at the end of your legs. But even with the grog's help, a pirate can't survive on liquid lies alone. Your body is a furnace, and a furnace needs fuel. While the alcohol is busy tricking your brain, your stomach is starting to demand something more substantial, something that can actually be converted into the calories needed to keep your heart beating against the North Atlantic chill. You're going to need the hardtack buffet, a culinary experience that is less about flavor and more about structural integrity. As the grog haze thickens, you find yourself dreaming of the one thing that can truly anchor a man to the world, a biscuit so hard it could be used as a weapon of war. Your stomach gives a low, hollow growl that competes with the creak of the hull. The grog was a fine chemical distraction, but your internal furnace is running out of coal. In the freezing winter, your body is burning calories at triple the normal rate just to keep your blood from turning into slush. To survive the night, you need a midnight snack that's less about farm to table, freshness, and more about rock to stomach durability. You reach into the small canvas pouch hanging from the side of your hammock and pull out a piece of hardtack. This is the cornerstone of the pirate's winter diet, a foodstuff so legendary for its toughness that it's less like a recipe and more like an ongoing edible experiment. To help you visualize hardtack, don't think of a cracker or a biscuit. Think of a square of dried, compressed construction material. It's made of flour, water, and perhaps a pinch of salt if the quartermaster was feeling particularly festive that day. It's baked until every single molecule of moisture has been banished, making it essentially a piece of edible masonry. If you tried to bite into it directly, you'd leave your teeth behind like a sacrificial offering to the ocean. In a modern kitchen, this would be a coaster. Here, it's a life-saving caloric battery. It's the original protein bar, if that bar was designed by someone who hated joy. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that hardtack was designed for longevity, not palatability. Because it was so dry, it could theoretically last for years without rotting. This was vital for long winter voyages where fresh bread would have turned into a fuzzy green science project within 48 hours of leaving port. The calorie density was the point. You aren't eating for pleasure, you're eating for the raw energy needed to stand on a frozen deck and pull ropes that weigh as much as a small horse. You lie back in your hammock and perform the ritual of the long soak. You don't chew hardtack, you negotiate with it. You take a small piece and tuck it into the side of your cheek, letting your saliva slowly soften the edges. It tastes like dusty cardboard and ancient secrets. As you wait for the biscuit to become pliable, you're reminded of the quirky fringe tidbit that sailors often called these molar breakers or sheet iron. Some pirates were known to carve their initials or even crude maps into their hardtack rations, using them as tiny, edible slates before eventually succumbing to hunger and eating their own homework. There's even a persistent legend that some particularly desperate sailors used stale hardtack as a makeshift hammer to fix small leaks in the hull. Historians still argue whether the weevil infestation in hardtack was actually considered a nuisance or a welcome addition of protein. Most hardtack of the medieval period was home to bargemen, tiny beetles or larvae that thrived in the dry flour. To help you visualize this, think of your breakfast cereal, but the little marshmallows are alive and trying to run away. The standard technique for dealing with this in the dark of the birthing deck was the tap and wait. You tap the biscuit against a hard surface, in this case the side of your wooden sea chest, and wait for the residents to fall out. In the winter darkness, you can't see them anyway. You just hope they don't have too much crunch. As the hardtack finally softens in your mouth, you feel a slow, steady release of complex carbohydrates. This is the fuel your body needs to generate real, sustainable heat, unlike the flash in the pan warmth of the grog. It's a heavy, grounding feeling. Your stomach settles, and the shivering that had started to creep back into your shoulders begins to subside. You're literally building a fire inside yourself. You might also have a bit of portable soup, a medieval invention that was essentially a dehydrated, gelatinous brick of meat stock. It looked like a piece of dark, translucent rubber. You'd break off a shard and let it dissolve on your tongue, providing a sudden hit of salt and protein. To a modern palate, it sounds like a nightmare. To a freezing pirate, it's a 5-star tasting menu. The salt is especially important. It helps your body retain water, preventing the dehydration that can ironically happen in the middle of a frozen ocean when all the available water is either salt-heavy or locked in ice. The act of eating in the dark has a strange, meditative quality. You're listening to the ship, feeling the sway, and focusing entirely on the sensation of your jaw moving. It's a very primal form of self-care. You aren't thinking about the loot you're supposed to find or the merchant ships you're hunting. You're just a mammal, eating a rock in a wooden box on a cold sea. This simplification of existence is one of the secrets to the best sleep. When your world is reduced to the basics, warmth, a hammock, and a piece of hardtack, your brain stops worrying about the what-ifs of life and settles into the now. Around you, other men are doing the same. You hear the rhythmic tap 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 of biscuits being cleared of weevils, a sound that echoes through the hold like a very lazy woodpecker. It's part of the ambient noise, as much a part of the ship as the creaking oak. You finish your ration, the last of the softened flour sliding down your throat, and you feel a sense of heavy, caloric satisfaction. It's the kind of fullness that leads to a deep, dreamless slumber. You tuck the canvas pouch back into its place. Your hands are a little sticky, and your beard probably has a few crumbs of sheet iron caught in it, but you don't care. The hardtack buffet is over, and the guest of honor, your metabolism, is finally happy. The grog and the biscuit have teamed up to create a perfect storm of drowsiness. You feel your eyelids getting heavier, the shadows on the ceiling blurring into a soft, gray mist. But as you drift off, you catch a glimpse of the officers' quarters toward the stern. A tiny, slightly more private area where the captain and his mates sleep. It's a reminder that even in a lawless pirate society, equality has its limits. While you're swinging in a communal human burrito line, they have their own versions of comfort. You realize that best sleep is a sliding scale, and your position on that scale depends entirely on where you sit in the ship's hierarchy. But for now, with a stomach full of construction material and a head full of grog, you wouldn't trade your swinging canvas for a king's bed. Well, maybe you would, but the king isn't here, and the hammock is. As you settle back into the rhythmic sway of the berthing deck, your eyes wander toward the stern of the ship. Through the thick, humid haze of 60 breathing men and the flickering light of the horn lanterns, you can see the heavy wooden bulkhead that separates the common crew from the after cabin. In the pirate world, this is the velvet rope of the VIP lounge. While the pirate code often preached a radical, early form of democracy where every man had a vote and a share of the loot, the laws of physics and ship design dictated a very clear hierarchy of sleep. Even in a society of rebels, the guy in charge of navigating the ship through a frozen minefield of icebergs gets a slightly better mattress than the guy responsible for scraping barnacles. To help you visualize this, think of the ship as a very small, floating apartment building. You are currently in the basement, sharing a studio apartment with 50 other people and a few hundred rats. The captain and the quartermaster, however, are in the penthouse. Now, by modern standards, their penthouse is still a cramped, leaky wooden box that smells like old leather and damp paper. But in the context of a 14th century winter, it's the height of luxury. The main difference isn't just space, it's the quality of the insulation and the proximity to the ship's only intentional heat source. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that the captain's cabin was almost always located at the stern or the back of the ship. This wasn't just for the view, the stern was structurally the most reinforced part of the vessel. It was also situated directly above the great cabin or near the galley's chimney stack. This meant that any residual heat from the cooking fires, which were carefully extinguished at night to prevent the ship from becoming a floating bonfire, would rise and linger in the captain's quarters. While you're relying on the tactical body heat of the man next to you, the captain might actually have a small charcoal-filled brazier, or at least a few extra layers of heavy velvet curtains to trap the air. You look at the bulkhead door and imagine the scene inside. Instead of a canvas hammock, the captain likely has a box bed, a wooden frame built directly into the side of the hull. It looks like a large, fancy dresser drawer that someone has stuffed with a straw mattress, and if they've had a successful season of raiding, perhaps a few woolen blankets stolen from a Flemish merchant ship. To a pirate, a real blanket is like a status symbol you can sleep under. It's the medieval equivalent of a designer watch. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. Because the captain's bed was built into the hull, he was literally sleeping against the ribs of the ship. Some captains claimed they could hear the ocean better this way, interpreting the groans of the timber and the slap of the waves as a form of maritime Morse code. They believed that by pressing their ear against the oak while they slept, they could sense a change in the wind or the approach of a storm before anyone else on the ship. It's a bit of mystical sea captain lore, but in a world where your survival depends on your instincts, a bed that doubles as a sonar system is a pretty good perk. Historians still argue whether the pirate egalitarianism extended to these sleeping arrangements. Some accounts of famous pirate republics suggests that during a cold winter, the captain's cabin would be opened up to the sick or the injured, turning the VIP lounge into a temporary infirmary. This would have been a radical departure from the rigid, class-based structures of the Royal Navies, where an officer wouldn't be caught dead sharing a room with a common seaman. In the pirate world, the captain's best sleep was often a tenuous privilege that could be revoked by a crew vote if he wasn't perceived as earning his comfort. You, however, are not the captain. You are part of the Canvas Collective, but as you look at your own cramped surroundings, you realize that your hammock has one major advantage over the captain's fancy box bed: the gimbal effect. Remember how we talked about the hammock staying level while the ship rolls? The captain, tucked into his fixed wooden bunk, is feeling every single lurch, tilt, and shudder of the hull. Every time the ship hits a wave, he's being pressed against the wood or rolled toward the edge of his mattress. He has the warmth and the blankets, but he lacks the suspension system that you currently enjoy. It's a classic trade-off. He has the heated seats, but you have the off-road suspension. The hierarchy also dictated the sleep schedule. While the crew is locked into the brutal 4-hour watch rotation, the captain and the high-ranking officers, like the master or the cooper, usually had the luxury of undisturbed sleep, unless, of course, the ship was about to hit a rock or a rival vessel. This continuous sleep is perhaps the greatest luxury of all. To help you visualize the value of this, think about how you feel when your alarm goes off after only 4 hours versus how you feel after a full 8. The captain's brain is likely functioning at a much higher capacity than yours, which is good because he's the one holding the map. You close your eyes and the image of the captain's cabin fades, replaced by the reality of your own swinging world. You hear a muffled thump from above, someone on the upper deck dropping a frozen coil of rope. It sounds like a distant gunshot. You realize that even with the hierarchy, everyone on this ship is in the same frozen boat. The captain's blankets might be softer, and his air might be a few degrees warmer, but he's still only a few inches of oak away from the same icy death that waits for you. There's a strange sense of comfort in that shared vulnerability. It makes the best sleep feel like a collective victory. You aren't jealous of the captain. You're just glad someone is warm enough to keep their hands steady on the wheel. You adjust your itchy wool hood, pull the canvas of the hammock a little tighter around your shoulders, and decide that the penthouse is overrated. You have the rhythm of the ship, the warmth of your mates, and the grog-induced peace of a man with no responsibilities other than staying alive until the next spell. But as the ship gives a particularly violent lurch, you're reminded that the rhythm of the ship isn't always a gentle lullaby. Sometimes, the ocean decides to turn your rocking chair into a mechanical bull. You're about to experience what happens when the best sleep meets a North Atlantic gale, a sensory experience that involves a lot more gravity and a lot less peace. The ship suddenly drops. It's not the gentle, rhythmic dip you've grown accustomed to. It's a gut-wrenching plunge that makes your stomach attempt to relocate to your throat. You've just entered the territory of nature's violent rocking chair. A winter gale in the North Atlantic is less of a weather event and more of a physical assault on the very concept of stability. Up on deck, the world is a chaotic nightmare of freezing spray and screaming wind, but down here in the berthing deck, the experience is translated into a terrifying, high-stakes game of pendulum physics. To help you visualize this, imagine taking your bed and placing it inside a giant wooden elevator that is being operated by a toddler having a tantrum. The elevator isn't just going up and down, it's swinging side to side and occasionally shuddering as if it's been hit by a wrecking ball. This is the best sleep turned into a test of core strength. You are suspended in your hammock, and because of that gravity-based gimbal effect we talked about earlier, you are technically the most stable object in the room. But stable is a relative term when the room itself is trying to do a barrel roll. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that during a severe storm, the roll of a medieval ship could reach angles of 30 to 40 degrees. This meant that if you were standing on the deck, the floor would literally become a wall. For the men in the hammocks, this resulted in a collective, synchronized swinging motion. As the ship tips to the starboard side, 60 hammocks all swing in unison toward the hull. Then, as the ship rights itself and plunges to port, the entire human forest swings back toward the center of the ship. It's like a giant, hairy, snoring clock pendulum. The sound is what truly changes during a storm. The usual sensory symphony is replaced by the gale's percussion. Every time the hull slams into a massive swell, it sounds like a cannon going off right next to your ear. A sharp, bone-shaking crack that vibrates through the oak, into the hemp ropes, and directly into your spine. You can hear the water rushing past the hull planks just inches from your head. A hissed, angry roar that reminds you that only a few inches of seasoned timber and tar are keeping the entire ocean from inviting itself into your bed. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some veteran pirates were so attuned to the voice of the ship during a storm that they claimed they could sleep through a hurricane as long as the rhythm stayed consistent. They developed a condition known as sea legs for the brain, where the only thing that would actually wake them up was a lack of motion. If the ship suddenly hit a calm patch or, heaven forbid, got stuck in the eye of the storm, the sudden stillness would act like a bucket of ice water to their faces. They would sit bolt upright in the silence, their internal equilibrium screaming that something was wrong. Historians still argue whether sailors ever actually lashed themselves into their hammocks during these violent storms. While some later naval manuals suggest using a clew or a safety strap to prevent being thrown out, medieval pirate life was a bit more freestyle. Most likely, the high sides of a weighted hammock were enough to keep you tucked in, provided you didn't panic. If you did fall out, you weren't falling onto a plush carpet, you were falling onto a moving wooden floor, potentially landing on top of a sea chest or another sailor, which is a great way to start a midnight fistfight. You find yourself gripping the sides of your canvas sling, your knuckles white even in the dim lantern light. Every time the ship lurches, you feel the tension in the overhead beams. You can hear the oak weeping, the sound of the wood fibers stretching and compressing under the weight of thousands of tons of seawater. It sounds like 1,000 tiny violins being played poorly. To help you visualize the stress the ship is under, think of the vessel not as a solid object, but as a living, flexible organism that is currently wrestling a liquid giant. You are inside the giant's stomach, and the giant is losing. There is a strange, dark humor in the way the crew reacts to this. You hear a muffled curse from 3 hammocks over as someone's personal belongings, perhaps a tin cup or a wooden spoon, escape their pouch and go skittering across the floorboards. In the dark, the object sounds like a frantic mouse running for its life. No one moves to catch it. In a storm, finders keepers is replaced by whatever the gravity gods want, they take. You just pull your wool hood tighter over your ears, trying to muffle the roar of the ocean. Psychologically, the storm creates a weird form of survival sleep. You aren't entering a deep REM cycle. You're hovering in a state of hypervigilance. Your body is constantly making micro adjustments to the sway, your muscles tensing and relaxing in sync with the waves. It's an exhausting way to rest. You'll wake up feeling like you've just run a marathon, despite having spent the last 4 hours lying down. It's the ultimate irony of pirate life. The more the world tries to move you, the harder you have to work to stay still. But even in the middle of a gale, there is a sense of security in the pack. You aren't the only one swinging in the dark. You can hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of your mate, punctuated by the occasional grunt as someone is jostled by a particularly nasty wave. This collective endurance is a powerful sedative. If they aren't screaming in terror, you don't need to be either. You trust the ship, you trust the wood, and you trust the knots that are currently holding your entire world together. As the storm rages on, you begin to drift, the violent motion becoming a strange, chaotic lullaby. You've accepted that you are no longer in control. You are a passenger on a very angry, very cold roller coaster. You close your eyes and let the thud, hiss, creak of the ship become the background track to your dreams. But just as you're finally losing consciousness, you feel something small and furry brush against your hand as it grips the hammock rope. You've forgotten that you aren't the only one seeking warmth in this wooden fortress. The humans have the hammocks, but the other residents of the ship have their own ways of staying cozy. The sensation of something furry brushing against your hand isn't a surprise, it's a standard feature of the berthing deck. You've just encountered one of your unwanted bedfellows. On a medieval pirate ship, you are never truly alone. While you and your shipmates occupy the hammocks, the ship is home to a secondary crew of thousands. The rats, the mice, and the microscopic livestock living in the seams of your woolens. In the freezing winter, these creatures are just as desperate for warmth as you are, leading to a weird, symbiotic relationship that is both disgusting and oddly practical. To help you visualize the rat situation, don't think of the clean white lab rats of the modern world. Think of the black rat, Rattus rattus, a hardy, intelligent survivor with fur the color of soot and eyes like polished obsidian. These aren't just pests, they are the ship's unofficial waste management team. In the dark of the hold, you can hear them, a constant, skittering soundtrack of tiny claws on oak. During a storm, they move into the upper reaches of the ship, seeking high ground just like the humans. Sometimes, that high ground is your hammock. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that rats were an inescapable part of maritime life until the advent of steel hulls and chemical pesticides. A single merchant or pirate vessel could easily host a population of several hundred rats. They lived in the limber holes, the drainage gaps in the ship's ribs, and tunneled through the grain and hardtack stores. For a pirate, the presence of rats was actually a weirdly comforting sign. There was an old maritime superstition that rats possessed a sixth sense for shipwrecks. If you saw the rats frantically trying to leave the ship while it was in port, you didn't board that ship. As long as you heard them scurrying in the dark of the winter night, it meant the ship was still structurally sound enough for them to call home. Then there are the roommates you can't see. Your thick wool tunic, the one that's currently keeping you from freezing to death, is a 5-star resort for body lice. In the 14th century, lice were so common they were almost considered a part of the human anatomy. Historians still argue whether the constant scratching of the medieval sailor was a sign of poor hygiene or simply a biological tax for wearing wool in a damp environment. These seam squirrels, as later sailors called them, thrive on body heat. As you warm up in your hammock, they wake up and start their own nightly routine. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some pirates believed that having a certain amount of lice was a sign of a robust constitution. There was a folk belief that lice would abandon a body if the blood became sour or thin from disease. Therefore, if you were itchy, you were healthy. It's a wonderful bit of medieval gaslighting, convincing yourself that a parasitic infestation is actually a glowing health report. Some sailors even engaged in louse racing during the long, boring stretches of a winter voyage, placing their personal thoroughbreds on a heated plate to see which one could reach the edge first. It was the only sport available when the deck was too frozen for a stroll. You feel the rat move again. It's not biting, it's just huddling. In the extreme cold, even the rats will seek out the thermal islands provided by sleeping humans. It's a bizarre truce. You have the calories and the wool, they have the fur and the instinct. To help you visualize this, imagine a very tiny, very dirty, heated blanket that occasionally squeaks. You don't shoo it away because, honestly, you're too tired, and the extra few degrees of warmth it provides to your hand are actually quite nice. It's a moment of interspecies solidarity in the face of a North Atlantic winter. The smell of the rats adds another layer to the sensory symphony. It's a sharp, musky scent that cuts through the heavy smell of wet wool and vinegar. You've become so accustomed to it that you'd probably find a clean room suspiciously odorless. You listen to them gnawing on something in the dark. Perhaps a stray piece of that hardtack you dropped earlier. The scritch, scritch, scritch of their teeth is a rhythmic domestic sound. It reminds you that life, in all its messy, persistent forms, is continuing despite the ice outside. Psychologically, these unwanted bedfellows serve as a reminder of your own animal nature. Down here in the dark, stripped of your rank and your loot, you are just another mammal trying to keep its internal temperature at a functional level. There's a strange humility in sharing your bed with a rodent. It levels the playing field. The lice don't care if you're the most feared pirate on the Spanish Main. Your blood tastes the same as the cabin boys. You shift slightly, and the movement causes a ripple of activity in the human forest. A few hammocks over, a man groans in his sleep and scratches his chest with a fervor that suggests a very active colony of lice. The sound of fingernails on coarse wool is a dry, rasping noise. You realize that best sleep isn't about being perfectly comfortable. It's about reaching a state of functional apathy. You are itchy, you are surrounded by rats, and you are damp. But you are warm enough to dream. That is the pirate's definition of a win. As you finally fall into a deeper sleep, the boundaries between you and the ship begin to blur. The creaking of the oak feels like your own joints. The rushing water outside feels like your own blood. You are no longer an individual. You are a component of this wooden hive, a warm body in a dark space, protected by the thermal bridge of your shipmates and the incidental heat of your furry neighbors. But this peace is temporary. The clock is always ticking. On a ship, time isn't measured in hours, but in the tolling of a bell. Just as you have reached that perfect, hazy equilibrium where the itchiness and the cold have faded into the background, the world is about to call you back to the surface. The bell's toll is coming, and with it, the brutal reality of the midnight watch. You have a few more minutes of best sleep left. Make them count. The deep, wool-muffled silence of your subconscious is shattered by a sound that feels like a physical blow to the head. Clang, clang, clang. It's the ship's bell, the brass heartbeat of the vessel, and right now, it's the most hated sound in the world. It's exactly midnight, or 8 bells, and your 4-hour window of luxury has just slammed shut. This is the bell's toll and midnight watch rotations. The moment where the dream of warmth is forcibly replaced by the reality of the freezing dark. You have to leave the human incubator and return to the industrial freezer. To help you visualize the transition, imagine being woken up from the best nap of your life by someone dumping a bucket of ice water on your head, then being told you have to go stand on the roof of a moving car for 4 hours in a snowstorm. Your brain is screaming for just 5 more minutes, the universal human plea, But the pirate code is a jealous mistress. If you aren't on deck when the watch changes, you aren't just lazy, you're a liability. In the winter, a missing man on watch can mean the difference between spotting a rogue ice floe and becoming a permanent resident of the seabed. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is the sandglass system used to track time. Since mechanical clocks were either non-existent or completely unreliable on a tossing ship, the quartermaster or a designated boy would watch a half-hour sandglass. Every time the sand ran out, they'd flip the glass and strike the bell. One strike for the first half hour, two for the second, and so on, until 8 bells marked the end of the 4-hour watch. This means your sleep was literally measured out in falling grains of dust. You've just lived through 8 flips of the glass and your time is up. You move to sit up and the first thing you feel is the thaw pain. As your muscles move, the warmth you've spent 4 hours accumulating begins to dissipate. The air outside your hammock feels like a razor blade against your skin. You swing your legs over the side of the canvas, and your feet, still tucked into those straw-filled leather boots, meet the damp, freezing floorboards. The contrast is agonizing. The floor is so cold it feels like it's burning your soles. You reach for your heavy wool coat, which is hanging from a nearby peg. It's cold. It's heavy. It's slightly stiff from the salt and the humidity. Putting it on is like wearing a suit of armor made of frozen moss. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. Because the transition from a warm hammock to a frozen deck was so physically traumatic, some pirates practiced preheating. They would take a small piece of hot charcoal from the dying embers of the galley stove, if they were lucky enough to have one, and place it inside a perforated tin box known as a hand warmer. They'd tuck this into their waistband or keep it in a pocket to give their core a fighting chance against the initial shock of the upper deck. Others simply did a pirate jig, a series of frantic hopping movements and arm swinging to get the blood pumping before they climbed the ladder. It looked like a very aggressive, very uncoordinated dance of despair. Historians still argue whether the midnight watch was the most dangerous time for accidents. While logic suggests that the darkness and the ice would lead to more falls, some scholars point out that the crew was often at their most alert during this time because of the fear. The sheer adrenaline of knowing that a single slip meant death acted as a powerful stimulant. You aren't sleepy. Once you hit the deck, you are in a state of vibrating, wide-eyed terror that your body misinterprets as being awake. You begin the climb. The ladder is slick with a fine coat of frost that has managed to sneak down through the hatch. Your fingers, already going numb, grip the rungs. As your head breaks the plane of the upper deck, the wind hits you. It's not just cold, it's a physical force that tries to push you back down. The sensory symphony of the hold is replaced by the screaming void. The stars above are sharp and clinical, offering no warmth, and the sea spray hitting your face feels like being pelted with tiny frozen needles. To help you visualize the deck at midnight, think of a black and white movie where the only colors are shades of charcoal and bone white ice. Everything is moving. The ropes are humming a low, haunting chord as the wind vibrates through them. You see the men you are replacing. They look like statues made of salt. They don't speak as they pass you, they just head for the hatch with the single-minded focus of a moth heading for a flame. They are going to your hot bunk. They are going to inherit your warmth. You take your station near the rail. Your job for the next 4 hours is to stare into the darkness and look for growlers, small, ship-killing chunks of ice that sit low in the water. You wrap your arms around yourself, tucked into your woolly fortress, and try to maintain the internal ember. You realize that the best sleep you just had was a psychological anchor. Without those 4 hours of swinging in the dark, you wouldn't have the mental reserves to stand here now. The hammock wasn't just a bed, it was a battery charger for your soul. You look down at your hands, which are starting to turn a pale, ghostly blue. You remember the liquid blanket of grog and the hardtack buffet, and you can still feel the faint weight of them in your system. They are the only things keeping you upright. You find yourself counting the minutes until the next strike of the bell. 1 bell, 2 bells. The time on watch feels like it's moving through molasses. Every minute is an hour, every hour is an eternity. But as the wind howls, you find a weird, rhythmic comfort in the rocking of the ship. Even standing up, you're swaying. Your body has been programmed by the hammocks to find peace in the motion. You close your eyes for a split second, just a micro nap, and you can almost feel the canvas against your back again. You are a creature of two worlds, the warm, smelly hive below and the cold, screaming void above. And as the frost begins to build up on your eyelashes, you start to wonder if the best sleep isn't actually a dream, but a memory you're using to survive the waking nightmare. The cold isn't just a sensation anymore, it's a physical weight that has begun to settle into your joint. Standing on the midnight watch, your knees feel like they've been filled with dry sand, and your fingers have moved past numb into a strange, rhythmic throbbing. This is where we encounter the frostbite remedies and medieval maritime medicine. On a 14th century pirate ship, there is no doctor. There isn't even a first aid kit. There is usually just a surgeon, which is a fancy title for a guy who is slightly better at sharpening knives than he is at sailing, and whose primary medical philosophy is, if it looks bad, cut it off. To help you visualize the medical care you can expect, imagine a garage workshop where the mechanic has decided to diversify into human repair. The tools are rusty, the anesthetic is just a larger than usual mug of grog, and the sterile environment is a wooden table that was used for gutting fish 20 minutes ago. If you come off the watch with toes the color of charcoal or fingers that won't uncurl, you aren't looking for a cure, you're looking for a miracle. Medicine in this era is really just polite torture with a theology degree mixed with a heavy dose of, well, let's see what happens if we rub this on it. Our mainstream historical fact for this section involves the treatment of frostbite, or the winter bite, as it was often called. Medieval maritime wisdom dictated that you should never, ever use hot water to thaw a frozen limb. On this point, they were actually right. Rapidly heating frozen tissue causes the cell walls to burst, leading to permanent damage. Their solution, however, was a bit more creative. They believed in the similia similibus curantur principle, like cures like. To treat a frozen foot, they would often rub it vigorously with salt and slushy ice, or in some cases, wrap it in the warm, freshly removed skin of a slaughtered animal, usually a ship's goat or a large rat, to draw out the humors of the ice. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. For the deep, thrumming aches that come from sleeping in a damp hammock during a freeze, what we would now recognize as early onset arthritis or rheumatism, pirates had a very specific liniment. They would take the rendered fat of a porpoise or a shark, mix it with crushed garlic and a splash of turpentine, and rub it into their joints. It didn't actually fix the joints, but it created such an intense chemical burn on the surface of the skin that you forgot your knees hurt because you were too busy worrying about why your legs were on fire. It also ensured that no one would want to sleep within 10 feet of you, giving you the rarest of all pirate luxuries, extra elbow room in the human forest. Historians still argue whether these crews used willow bark or other natural salicylates, the precursor to aspirin, to manage the pain of the winter watch. While land-based medieval apothecaries certainly used it, the supply chain for a pirate ship in the middle of a raiding season was unreliable. Most likely, the only aspirin you had was a piece of leather to bite down on while someone massaged your frozen calves with a mixture of salt and vinegar. You find yourself leaning against the mast, trying to keep your weight off your heels. Your mind drifts back to the hammock below. You remember the sensory symphony and the unwanted bedfellows with a sudden, sharp longing. Down there, even with the lice and the rats, you were horizontal. Up here, gravity is an enemy. You start to experience the phantom sleep, a psychological phenomenon where your brain begins to project the imagery of your bed onto the frozen world around you. The white foam of a breaking wave starts to look like a fluffy wool blanket. The rhythmic creak of the rigging sounds like the breathing of your shipmates. To help you visualize this mental state, think of it as maritime sleepwalking. You are physically awake, your eyes are open, and you are technically performing your duties. But a large portion of your consciousness has gone back downstairs to lie in the canvas. It's a dangerous state of being. You have to keep moving. You start to perform the pirate's inventory, a mental game where you name every item in your sea chest just to keep your brain from freezing solid. One spare tunic, one wooden bowl, a stolen silver spoon, a lock of hair from a girl in a port you can't remember the name of. The medicine of the winter ship wasn't just physical, it was social. If you saw a mate looking ghostly, the pale, wide-eyed look of someone slipping into hypothermia, you didn't call a doctor. You grabbed them and forced them to move. You'd engage in the bracing, which was essentially a consensual wrestling match on the icy deck. By fighting and shoving each other, you forced the blood to move, generated friction heat, and broke the trance of the phantom sleep. It was a brutal, sweaty form of communal care. As the bells continue to toll, marking the slow passage of your watch, you realize that best sleep is a carrot that the universe dangles in front of you to keep you moving through the stick of the cold. You aren't standing here for the loot or the glory, you're standing here for the right to go back to that smelly, swinging hammock. The anticipation of the long sleep at the end of the voyage is a powerful motivator, but the anticipation of the next 4-hour nap is what keeps your heart beating. You look at the horizon, searching for a hint of gray that might signal the dawn, but the winter night is a stubborn beast. It feels like the sun has been retired and the moon is now in charge of the company. You adjust your oily wool hood, feeling the salt crystals that have formed in your beard. You are a masterpiece of medieval survival, a collection of aches and pains held together by grease, grog, and the stubborn refusal to die. You might be a pirate, an outlaw, and a rogue, but right now, you're just a patient in the world's largest, coldest hospital, waiting for your next dose of hammock therapy. But before that can happen, the night has one more trial for you. As the fatigue reaches its peak, your mind begins to wander into the darker corners of maritime folklore. When the body is this tired and the world is this dark, the line between iceberg and sea monster starts to get very, very thin. You're about to enter the psychological toll of the winter night, where the ghosts of the deep come out to play with your sleep-deprived brain. The 8th bell of your watch is still a long way off, and the physical cold has finally breached your mental fortifications. This is the hour of the sea monsters and nightmares, a period where sleep deprivation and the oppressive North Atlantic darkness conspire to fracture your reality. When you haven't had more than 4 hours of interrupted sleep in weeks, and your diet consists of molar breakers and liquid lies, your brain starts to fill the gaps in the environment with its own terrifying projections. The ocean isn't just water anymore, it's a vast, ink-black tapestry of folklore and existential dread. To help you visualize this mental state, think of it as maritime sleepwalking on steroids. You are standing at the rail, your eyes fixed on the horizon, but your subconscious has started to leak into your vision. That jagged piece of drift ice bobbing in the swells doesn't look like ice anymore. For a split second, it's the pale, bloated hand of a drowned sailor reaching for the hull. The whistling of the wind through the frozen rigging isn't just air moving over him. It sounds like the muffled screams of the sirens or the Draugr, the undead Norse spirits who haunt the cold northern seas. In the 14th century, these weren't just stories. They were as real as the scurvy in your gums. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that maritime folklore was a critical part of how sailors processed the trauma of the sea. Without modern meteorology or biology, the unexplained was attributed to supernatural forces. This created a culture of extreme superstition. You wouldn't whistle on deck during a winter night because whistling might call the wind and turn a gale into a hurricane. You wouldn't mention umbrellas or rabbits because certain words were believed to carry the weight of bad luck, enough to sink a ship. For a sleep-deprived pirate, the world is a minefield of omens. Then there are the nightmares that happen while you're actually awake. You experience what sailors called the doldrum of the mind, a trance-like state where you see entire cities rising out of the waves, or you hear your mother's voice calling your name from the crest of a breaking swell. This is the psychological toll of the winter night. Your brain is desperately trying to enter a REM cycle, but because your body is standing up and freezing, the dream state simply superimposes itself over the physical world. It's a waking hallucination that feels more real than the wood beneath your boots. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some medieval sailors carried hagstones, naturally occurring stones with a hole through the center, tied around their necks or tucked into their hammocks. They believed that looking through the hole would allow them to see true reality, stripping away the illusions cast by sea spirits. More importantly, they believed these stones would prevent the old hag, a traditional explanation for sleep paralysis, from sitting on their chest and stealing their breath while they slept. When you're sleeping in a cramped, humid hold with 50 other men, sleep paralysis is a very real risk, often triggered by the weight of the heavy wool and the lack of fresh air. Historians still argue whether the visions reported by early explorers and pirates were purely psychological or the result of ergotism, a type of poisoning caused by a fungus that grows on rye and grain. Since hardtack was often made from questionable flour stores, it's entirely possible that the entire crew was effectively tripping on low-grade LSD for the duration of the winter. This would explain why so many logs from this era mention sea serpents that look remarkably like the very ropes the sailors were handling every day. You find yourself shivering, but not just from the temperature. You look at the man on watch next to you, the one who was bracing you earlier. He's staring into the dark with a look of pure, unadulterated focus. You wonder what he sees. Does he see the kraken? The giant cephalopod that medieval scholars argued could swallow a ship whole? Or is he just seeing the face of a creditor back in Bristol? In the dark of the North Atlantic, there is very little difference between a monster and a memory. Both can keep you awake, both can make your heart skip a beat. This psychological pressure is why the best sleep in the hammock is so vital. It's not just about physical recovery, it's about resetting the mind. When you go below, you aren't just escaping the cold, you're escaping the ghosts. The communal warmth and the rhythmic snoring of the human hive act as a psychological anchor, pulling you back from the edge of madness. It's hard to believe in sea monsters when you can hear your mate, Barnaby, struggling with a particularly stubborn boogeyman in his sleep 3 feet away. To help you visualize the value of this, imagine your brain as a computer that has too many tabs open. The winter watch opens tabs for freezing, drowning, monsters, and regret. The 4 hours in the hammock is the restart button. Without it, the system eventually crashes, leading to what was known as sea fever, a state of total mental breakdown where a sailor might simply step off the deck into the ocean, believing they were walking onto a green field of grass. You grip the rail harder, feeling the ice glaze bite into your palms. You force yourself to look at the stars, using their cold, fixed positions to ground yourself in reality. They don't move. They don't whisper. They don't want your soul. They are just navigation points. You take a deep breath of the freezing air, and for a moment, the hallucinations recede. The sea serpent turns back into a frosted anchor cable. The ghostly hand turns back into a piece of sea foam. You've survived another hour of the psychological gauntlet, but as the fatigue begins to settle in again, you find yourself turning toward a more pleasant form of mental escape. If you can't be warm in reality, you'll be warm in your head. You begin to construct the thaw, a mental sanctuary of tropical islands, sun-drenched beaches, and the promise of the loot that's waiting for you at the end of this frozen tunnel. It's the ultimate pirate daydream, and it's the only thing that's going to get you through the final hours of the watch. You've reached the point of exhaustion where your body feels less like flesh and bone and more like a heavy, rusted mechanism. The wind is still screaming and the sea monsters are still lurking in the corners of your vision, but you found a new weapon, the thaw. This is the mental escape used by every pirate who has ever survived a winter at sea. To help you visualize this, imagine your mind is a high-definition projector. While your physical body is standing in a walk-in freezer in northern Norway, your internal cinema is playing a loop of a sun-drenched beach in the Caribbean, where the sand is so hot it burns your feet and the water is the color of a melted sapphire. This isn't just a daydream, it's a survival strategy. You're dreaming of the tropical looting grounds, the Spanish Main, the Florida Keys, or the lush coastlines of Africa. You visualize the moment the ship finally turns south, the ice on the rigging beginning to melt and drip like tears of joy onto the deck. You can almost feel the sun hitting your back, soaking through that itchy wool, and finally, mercifully reaching your skin. In this mental sanctuary, the smell of salt and old grease is replaced by the scent of roasting pork, overripe mangoes, and the heavy, sweet perfume of tropical jasmine. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is that the golden age of piracy was largely driven by these geographic shifts. Pirates would follow the seasons like migratory birds. When the North Atlantic became a frozen graveyard, they would head south to the warmer latitudes where trade was year-round and the weather didn't require a seal blubber face mask. This great migration was the light at the end of the tunnel for every crewman. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of pirate raids was a direct result of the extreme deprivation they suffered during the winter months, a pent-up explosion of frustration released on the first warm prize they encountered. You find yourself leaning your forehead against the cold wood of the mast, your eyes closed for a heartbeat longer than a blink. In that second, you are no longer a shivering ghost. You are sitting in a seaside tavern in a port like Tortuga or Port Royal. You can feel the weight of a heavy gold doubloon in your palm. Not that you've seen much gold lately, but the idea of it is warm. You can hear the sound of a fiddle playing a fast, upbeat tune that makes your frozen toes want to tap. This is the best sleep of the mind, a state where the imagination provides the calories that the hardtack cannot. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. Many pirates were known to keep tokens of the sun in their pouches. This could be a dried tropical flower, a colorful parrot feather, or even a specific type of smooth, warm-colored stone from a southern beach. During the coldest nights, they would hold these objects using the tactile sensation to anchor their daydreams. It's a form of primitive sensory therapy. Some sailors even claimed they could smell the south in a piece of dried citrus peel they'd saved from a previous voyage, using the scent to block out the overwhelming stench of the bilge and the vinegar. As you stand there, the thaw becomes so vivid it almost feels dangerous. You're visualizing the long sleep that comes after a successful haul. In your mind, you aren't in a hammock anymore. You're in a real bed, in a real room that doesn't move. There's a fireplace nearby, crackling with dry cedar logs, and the blankets are made of heavy, clean linen. You visualize yourself sleeping for 24 hours straight, waking up only to drink a glass of cool water that doesn't taste like algae. This vision of civilian rest is the ultimate pirate fantasy. It's the pot of gold that justifies every frostbitten toe and every terrifying gale. To help you visualize the power of this mental escape, think of it as a pre-visualization technique used by modern athletes. You're training your brain to believe that the cold is temporary and the warmth is inevitable. If you lose that belief, the cold wins. The moment a pirate stops dreaming of the thaw is the moment they stop fighting to keep their core temperature up. It's the moment they let the sea fever take them. You, however, are a dreamer. You've already planned out exactly how you're going to spend your share of the loot, starting with the thickest, warmest, most ridiculous fur-lined cloak money can buy. The thaw also helps you process the sounds of the ship. The groaning of the hull is no longer a sign of structural failure. It's the sound of the ship running toward the equator. The spray on your face isn't ice, it's just a refreshing tropical mist. You've effectively hacked your own sensory input. It's a delicate balance, of course. If you lean too far into the dream, you'll miss the sight of a real ice floe and your thaw will become a permanent, icy sleep at the bottom of the sea. But in small doses, the daydream is the best medicine in the world. You look over at your shipmate again. He's smiling, a tiny cracked lip grin that looks painful in the freezing air. You realize he's in his own thaw. Maybe he's dreaming of a farm in the green hills of Ireland, or a vineyard in France. Every man on this deck is currently inhabiting a different, warmer world. This collective hallucination is what keeps the crew functional. You're a group of men pretending it's summer in the middle of a blizzard, and that shared delusion is a powerful bond. The bell strikes again. 7 bells. Only 30 minutes left. The thaw has done its job. It's carried you through the darkest, most hopeless part of the watch. You can feel the first faint change in the light, not a sunrise yet, but a thinning of the absolute blackness into a deep bruised purple. The long sleep is getting closer. You can almost feel the ladder beneath your boots, the descent back into the hold, and the return to the human hive. You've survived the night's peak, and the dream of the south has kept your heart from freezing. But as the watch ends and you prepare to hand over your post, the thaw begins to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-crushing reality. You don't just want to dream of sleep anymore, you want the real thing. You want the long sleep of the dock, the rest that comes when the anchor finally hits the mud and the ship stops its endless, violent dance. You're ready to transition from the survival of the sea to the sanctuary of the shore. The final chapter of your winter journey is about to begin. The final bell rings, 8 sharp brassy notes that cut through the frozen air like a victory fanfare. Your watch is over. The thaw of your imagination is about to be replaced by the physical, humid reality of the hold one last time. You descend the ladder, your movement slow and heavy, your boots clunking on the rungs with the weight of 1,000 miles of ice. As you drop back into the berthing deck, the warmth hits you again, but this time it feels different. It's no longer just a temporary reprieve, it's a gateway to the long sleep. The ship has finally begun its slow, deliberate turn toward a sheltered bay, the rhythmic pounding of the open sea giving way to a smoother, shallower roll. You reach your hammock, the same piece of coarse, salt-stained canvas that has been your only sanctuary in this frozen wasteland. It's warm. The man who just left it for the morning watch has done his duty, leaving behind a glowing coal of body heat for you to inherit. You slide in, and for the first time in weeks, you feel your muscles completely let go. The tension that has been holding your skeleton together against the gale simply evaporates. You aren't just sleeping, you are sinking. You are becoming part of the wood, part of the hemp, and part of the slow, rhythmic breathing of the ship as it prepares to drop anchor. Our mainstream historical fact for this final section is the long sleep ritual itself. When a medieval ship finally reached port or a safe winter anchorage after a brutal voyage, the crew was often granted a liberty of the hold. This meant that, barring a skeleton crew for guard duty, the men were allowed to sleep for as long as their bodies demanded, sometimes 18 or 20 hours straight. This was a biological necessity. The sleep debt accumulated during the 4-hour watch rotations was so severe that without this recovery period, the crew would have been physically incapable of the heavy labor required to unload the ship or perform repairs. As you lie there, the sounds of the ship begin to change. The screaming wind has died down to a low, melodic whistle in the rigging. The violent thwack of the hull against the swells is replaced by the gentle, repetitive lap, lap, lap of calm water against the oak. It's the sound of safety. You feel the heavy, metallic clunk and the long, vibrating rattlesnake hiss of the anchor cable being released. The ship shudders, swings slightly, and then stops. The forward motion is gone. The violent rocking chair has become a gentle cradle. Here is a quirky fringe tidbit. Some sailors were so conditioned by the constant motion of the sea that they found it impossible to sleep on land once they reached port. They would experience land sickness, a dizzying sensation where the ground felt like it was pitching and rolling beneath them. To combat this and get their long sleep, they would often bring their hammocks ashore and string them up in the rafters of a tavern or a warehouse, or even sleep in a rowboat tied to the pier. They needed the swing to convince their brains that it was safe to shut down. You, however, have the best of both worlds. You are in your familiar hammock, but the sea has finally called a truce. Historians still argue whether these periods of deep recovery were the reason pirates were able to maintain such high levels of performance during a raid. While naval sailors were often kept in a state of perpetual low-grade exhaustion, the pirates' cycle of extreme work and extreme rest may have given them a tactical edge. You aren't a cog in a military machine. You are a predator who has just finished a long, cold hunt and is now entering a state of temporary hibernation. You feel the sensory symphony fading out. The smell of the vinegar, the musky scent of the rats, and the oily tang of the wool are still there, but they've become a soft, blurred background. Your mind drifts back to that crocodile dung sunscreen and the liquid blankets of the past. They all seem like distant memories from a different life. In this moment, there is only the weight of your limbs, the softness of the swaying canvas, and the absolute blissful absence of responsibility. You have survived the coldest nights, the sea monsters, and the bells toll. You have earned this silence. The thaw is no longer a daydream. You can feel a true deep warmth spreading from your core to your toes. Not the false warmth of the grog, but the genuine heat of a body that knows it's safe. Your breathing slows, matching the gentle rise and fall of the ship in the harbor. The shadows on the ceiling are still, no longer dancing with the violent roll of the storm. You close your eyes, and the last thing you feel is the gentle brush of a woolly hood against your cheek. The winter is over, the hunt is done, the long sleep has finally come for you. The world of the ship is fading now. The sharp edges of the oak and the bite of the salt spray softening into a distant, hazy memory. You can feel the heavy weight of your own bed beneath you, a soft and stable sanctuary that doesn't demand anything from you. The sounds of the North Atlantic, the wind, the creaking timber, the rhythmic snoring of the crew are being replaced by the quiet, steady hum of your own room. The cold is a ghost, a story told by a dying fire, and you are tucked safely away from its reach. Imagine the ship drifting in a sea of velvet, the water so still it reflects the stars like a mirror. The ropes are quiet, the sails are furled, and the crew is a collection of shadows lost in a deep, peaceful slumber. There are no more bells to wake you, no more frozen decks to climb, and no more ice to watch for in the dark. You are floating in a warm, dark equilibrium where the only movement is the slow, rhythmic beat of your own heart. Let your thoughts drift like the smoke from a galley fire, rising slowly and disappearing into the night sky. The itch of the wool is gone, replaced by the cool touch of clean sheets. The smell of the sea is replaced by the scent of home. You are safe, you are warm, you are tired in the most wonderful way possible. The journey is over, and the only thing left to do is surrender to the weight of your own rest. The ship is at rest. The harbor is quiet, and the stars are watching over you. Everything is still. Everything is calm. Everything is exactly as it should be. Sleep now, traveler of the frozen seas. The thaw has reached your heart, and the night is yours to keep.